Hello and good day everyone. My name is Darlena Birch, MBA, RDN, and most importantly, public health dietitian. Welcome to my kitchen, aka Darlena's Kitchen, where I talk about the science of nutrition. 1, because I'm a dietitian, and 2, because I was forced into a chemistry minor. But who's bitter? Not me. In addition to discussing the science, I'll share some practical applications by preparing a simple recipe that you can make at home. I also want to say that during these episodes, I do get pretty sciencey and very heavy on the chemistry. So if you hear a term that you don't recognize, I'm going to include them in the description box along with my references. For my Darlena's Kitchen pilot episode, I'm going to talk about one of the 3 macronutrients, carbohydrates. You hear the term thrown around and you likely have a basic understanding of what a macronutrient is. However, I want to go beyond the surface level lingo and dive deeper into the chemistry upon which the terminology is based. At the end of today's episode, I'll prepare an easy meal that you can make at home. A macronutrient is defined as any of the nutritional components of the diet that are required in relatively large amounts. Macronutrients include carbohydrates, proteins, and fat. So let's start today's discussion off with carbohydrates. Did you know that carbohydrate means watered carbon? The term carbohydrate originates from the misinterpretation of the molecular formulas of many of these substances. For example, because its formula is C6H12O6, glucose was once thought to be a carbohydrate with the structure of C6H2O. Carbohydrates are any of the various neutral compounds of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, such as sugars, starches, and cellulose, most of which are formed by green plants and which constitute a major class of animal foods. Therefore, all carbohydrates consist of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, green plants are actually capable of synthesizing glucose from carbon dioxide and water using solar energy in a process known as photosynthesis. These plants can then use the glucose for energy or convert it to larger carbohydrates, such as starch or cellulose. Starch provides energy for later use, perhaps as nourishment for a plant's seeds, whereas cellulose is a structural material of plants. Humans can gather and eat the parts of the plant that store energy, such as the seeds, the roots, the tubers, and the fruits, and use some of that energy as well. Animals, including humans, cannot synthesize carbohydrates from carbon dioxide and water. Therefore, we are dependent on the plant kingdom to provide these vital compounds. Carbohydrates are needed by the human body for the synthesis of nucleic acids, along with many proteins and lipids. We use carbohydrates not only for food, but we also use it for clothing, shelter, fuel, and paper. The main takeaway here is that carbohydrates are created by plants through the photosynthesis of carbon dioxide and water. Humans then consume these carbohydrates in order to help our bodies perform a variety of biological functions. Now here's where I'm going to dive into the science of a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are actually divided into 4 major groups based on the size of the carbohydrate's molecular chain. These 4 groups are monosaccharides, disaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. Now think of the word saccharide as another term for sugar. The prefixes mono, di, oligo, and poly indicate the number of saccharide units in the chain itself. The simplest of carbohydrates, those that cannot be hydrolyzed to produce even smaller carbohydrates, are called monosaccharides. Therefore, a monosaccharide is the most basic form of a carbohydrate as well as the simplest form of sugar. Monosaccharides can be combined through glycosidic bonds to form larger carbohydrates known as oligosaccharides or polysaccharides. In fact, 2 or more monosaccharides can link together to form chains that contain from 2 to several hundred or thousands of monosaccharide units. Monosaccharides have many functions within cells. First and foremost, monosaccharides are used to produce energy and store energy. Most organisms create energy by breaking down the monosaccharide glucose and then harvesting the energy released from those bonds. So glucose, what is it? I'm sure you've heard the term before, so if you didn't know already, you now know that glucose is a monosaccharide. The 3 most commonly occurring monosaccharides are glucose, fructose, and galactose. So now that we've discussed the monosaccharides, I'm going to move on to the disaccharides. Now, disaccharide, as the name implies, means 2 saccharide units, aka 2 sugars. So disaccharide molecules ultimately have 2 monosaccharide units. The 3 major disaccharide units to know are sucrose, lactose, and maltose. Sucrose is the disaccharide of glucose and fructose. Sucrose is common table sugar and comes from sugarcane and sugar beets. Maple syrup also contains sucrose. Now, lactose is a disaccharide of glucose and galactose. If the term lactose sounds familiar to you, it's because it's also known as milk sugar and comprises anywhere between 2 to 8% of milk. Now, maltose forms when the enzyme known as amylase breaks down starches. We'll talk more about starches in a minute, but just know that maltose is formed in germinating cereal grains, and it's also important in the production of alcohol by fermentation. So now I'm going to move on to oligosaccharides. A carbohydrate whose molecules are composed of a relatively small number of monosaccharide units is referred to as an oligosaccharide. It comes from the Greek oligos, which means few, so oligosaccharide means few sugars. Typically, the term oligosaccharide refers to any polysaccharide that contains less than 20 monosaccharide units connected by a glycosidic bond. Chains with many monosaccharide units joined together are called polysaccharides. The term polysaccharide can be used to describe chains of monosaccharides of any length linked by glycosidic bonds. As we've discussed, green plants transform solar energy into chemical energy in the form of glucose. This is achieved through photosynthesis, aka magic and sorcery. But as useful as glucose is for energy, it's more of an immediate fix, and it's not particularly useful for long-term energy storage due to its high solubility in water. Because plant and animal cells are mostly aqueous salt solutions, glucose isn't particularly useful for energy storage. This is because glucose dissolves readily in water, thus allowing it to pass through cell membranes in response to concentration gradients. Therefore, in order to store glucose in one location, plants must condense it into a water-insoluble form. Now, this is where polysaccharides come into play. There are three important polysaccharides of which to be aware. They are starch, glycogen, and cellulose. Starches are actually glucose polymers containing anywhere between 300 to 1,000 glucose units. Starch is the main form of energy storage in plants, and all of these higher saccharides can actually be hydrolyzed back to their constituent monosaccharides. Amylose and amylopectin are the two most common components of naturally occurring starch. Amylose is the straight chain form of starch and consists of hundreds of linked glucose molecules. The branch form of starch is called amylopectin. Corn, potatoes, wheat, rice, and pasta all have high starch content, and they play a vital role in the human diet. Now allow me some time to quickly diverge to human biology. Amylase is an enzyme found in human saliva and the digestive tract. When you cook starches, partial hydrolysis occurs, thereby making starches more susceptible to further hydrolysis with amylase. In the small intestine, starch is hydrolyzed to form glucose. The glucose can then be converted to biochemical energy or stored for later use. Glycogen is an even more highly branched polysaccharide that serves a function of energy storage in animals. Glycogen is made and stored primarily in the cells of the liver and muscles. And depending on how my YouTube channel goes, there will be an episode dedicated entirely to glycogen, so please stay tuned. Now, cellulose is another polysaccharide consisting of anywhere from hundreds to over 10,000 glucose units. It is the structural component of the cell walls of green plants, and it's the single most common organic molecule on Earth. Roughly 1/3 of all plant matter is cellulose. But Darlena, why are you chewing my ear off about cellulose? It's simple, because cellulose is fiber. That's right, fiber is essentially a complex sugar consisting of anywhere between hundreds to over tens of thousands of glucose units. It's so complex that a vast majority of the planet's organisms can't digest it. Simply put, carbohydrates, both simple and complex, are sugar. How your body responds to said sugar depends on the complexity of the glucose chain. Still don't believe me? Convinced I'm a rogue dietitian selling you a bunch of lies? Then let me ask you this. The next time you're eating your favorite brand of cereal, what do you see when you read the carbohydrate line of the nutrition facts panel? If you see 3 indented subcategories under the carbohydrates line titled dietary fiber, total sugars, and added sugars, then the answer has actually been staring you in the face all along. But Darlena, if plants create carbohydrates through the process known as photosynthesis, and if carbohydrates are varying complexities of sugar, and if sugar is bad for me, then shouldn't I avoid all carbohydrates, including fruits and vegetables, forever? No, you shouldn't, because the fact of the matter is that the body needs carbohydrates. Humans need plants in order to obtain energy. Every digestible form of carbohydrate, whether used immediately or stored in the body, is ultimately intended to be broken down by the body into the monosaccharide glucose, to be used by your cells to fuel a plethora of biological processes. Additionally, glucose is virtually the sole fuel for the human brain, except during prolonged starvation. This is because the brain lacks fuel stores and hence requires a continuous supply of glucose. Fatty acids do not serve as fuel for the brain because they are bound to albumin in plasma and therefore do not traverse the blood-brain barrier. In starvation, ketone bodies generated by the liver partially replace glucose as fuel for the brain, but I'll talk more on this in a future episode. The average adult brain represents about 2% of our body weight, but uses 25% of the glucose in the body. Moreover, specific areas of the brain use glucose at different rates. Much of the brain's energy, estimates suggest from 60 to 70%, is used to power transport mechanisms that maintain the sodium-potassium membrane potential required for the transmission of the nerve impulses. The brain must also synthesize neurotransmitters and the receptors to propagate nerve impulses. So there you have it. Carbohydrates are sugars, and they're important to consume because your body needs them in order to function. Now on to today's recipe, carbohydrate salad. You get it? Because all salads are mostly carbohydrates, because plants and photosynthesis. Thank you for joining me today. If you like what you see, then please smash the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And remember, you are your own best advocate. Feed your body well, nourish your soul, nurture your mind, and nutrify your spirit. Remain true to yourself, and remember, every second forward is another opportunity to be a better version of your past self.